Hi everyone, I'm Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet Yomi, a joint project of Hadra and Yeshivat Drisha. The sugya that we'll be looking at today is really one of the last sugya, if not the last sugya in in Masechet Bava Batra, which is really makes it the last sugya in all of Masechet Nezikin. And what we're going to be talking about today is the idea of Shibud nechasim, or Shibud Karka'ot, of the idea of a lien on property, which, in layman's terms, right, under what circumstances can the bank come and foreclose my home, even if I'm not the one who borrowed money, but because, let's say, I bought the house from someone who had an outstanding loan, right? Is my house then kind of liened to that money that was owed by the other person, and can the bank who's owed the money show up and take foreclose my house, even though they really have no connection to me? They just lent the money to the person from whom I bought the house. So, right, that's really the case that's the idea of shibud nechasim, a concept that shows up all over Shas, and really one of the central mishnayot that talks about shibud nechasim is our mishnah here, the last mishnah in Masechet Bava Batra. So let's begin. What we'll be doing today is an opportunity really to see both kind of how the Gemara internally works. What kind of text is the Gemara? This text that was written really over the course of several hundred years, even though it's sort of presented as one book. Um, this sugya will be an opportunity to kind of dig deeper into the process through which the Gemara became the text it was, as well as what kind of text the Rishonim think it is. How do the Rishonim look at the Gemara and the relationship between the different sugyot, and how do they think about the Gemara and what kind of text it is? So let's take a look at the Mishnah, this last Mishnah in Masechet Bava Batra, which introduces us to the idea of shibud nechasim, and makes a distinction between two different kinds of loans: malve al peh and malve bishtar, meaning someone who lends money to someone else, but nothing's in writing; there's just aiding there, as opposed to malve bishtar, where the loan is written out in some kind of document, and that the malve gets to keep, and then he can pull out the document and say, "Here, look, you owe me money." So, according to the Mishnah, malve chavero bishtar gove minechasim mishupadim. But al yidei edim, which is to say, amal ve'al peh, govim min nechasim b'nei chorim. So the let's start with the simple case, which is actually the second case of amal ve'al peh, where I can collect only from the money that the borrower himself. If I'm the lender, I can collect only from the money that the borrower himself has on hand. And if, let's say, he's out of money, he can throw up his hands and I'm out of luck. But what happens with Maved Chaver B'Shtar if there was a document that was testament to the loan? I can collect from nechasim mishubadim, from liened property, which is to say that, let's say, at the moment when I lent money to Reuven owed the nechasim mishubadim have to be karka, have to be real estate. So let's say Reuven owned a house. And at the moment when I lent him the money, so that house has become liened to this loan. Lent him $1 million, let's say. He owns $1 million house. And then someone went and sold the house to somebody else. And from the time after I lent him the money, I, as the lender, can pull out my shtar. And even if I go to him and he says, I sold the house, I don't have the money to pay you back, I can go and I can collect the house from the buyer who bought the house from Reuven, because that house was liened to my loan. But according to the Mishnah, that is only the case for nechasim mishubadim. That is only the case for malva bishtar, for loans that were made bishtar, and is not the case for a loan that was made al peh or al yidei edim. Ad kan the Mishnah. Now, the Gemara actually begins with a machloket between Ula and Rabba, third generation Amoraim, in how they interpret the Mishnah, their reasoning behind the distinction between these two cases, Mal Bishtar and Mal Ve'al Peh. But we are actually going to begin with a later shlab in the retzif of the Gemara, right? A later stage in the sugya on the daf, because it later on in the Gemara, they bring an earlier a machloket of earlier Amoraim, of Rav and Shmuel on the one hand, and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish on the other, who are first generation Amoraim. So we're actually going to work in chronological order of the Gemara, as opposed to in the order in which the machlokot are presented in the Gemara. The Gemara brings this machloket between Rav and Shmuel, first generation Amora'ei Bavel on the one hand, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on the other, about the case of Malva al Peh, meaning about there's no shtar. And whether or not there is Shibud nechasim, whether or not there is a property lien on um, such loans. So Rav and Shmuel Amr Travaihu, Milva al Peh Eino Gove Lo Min HaYorshim V'Lo Min HaLekuchot. So some right a lien that was a loan that was just kind of made verbally does according to Rav and Shmuel does not collect from Lakuchot, which is the case that I spoke about before, meaning if someone buys the house, and also not from, let's say, Reuven, who borrowed money from me. Let's say he dies and his heirs inherit the house. So I, the borrower, the lender, can't go and collect from the heirs either. I can't collect from the people who bought the house, and I can't collect from heirs if instead of selling the house, he just passed it on when he died. My time of the Gemara asks on that, Shibuda lav deorayta, right? That shibud nechasim, the idea of property liens, is not a deorayta idea. Mi deorayta, I can only collect from the borrower himself with the money that he actually has. But and they're gonna Rav and Shmuel are gonna have to explain the case of the shtar. But milva al peh, right? No, a loan that was made verbally, there's no shibud nechasim because shibuda lav deorayta. So far, it seems to work pretty right. Rav and Shmuel's opinion works well with the Mishnah. Right, the Mishnah had the same deen in the case of milva al yedei edim, which is to say milva al peh, that you can't collect from that. There's no shibud nechasim you can't collect from anyone other than the borrower himself. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who are Amora'ei, first generation Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael, on the other hand, say the opposite. Milva al peh, gova bein min hayorshim, bein min halekuchot. That someone who that a milva al peh can borrow from both the heirs, from both Reuven's heirs, if Reuven died and left the house as property to his children, or from the lekuchot, from people who bought the house from Reuven. My time, says the Gemara. Shibuda deorayta. That property liens, right? Shibud nechasim is deorayta, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, al panav, it looks like they are directly in contradiction with the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Al yidei etim govim min nechasim b'nei chorin. Only from property that the borrower actually has on hand, and not from property that he left. Certainly not property that he sold. So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right? And this is actually a pattern that appears in a lot of places in Shas, like that when it comes to early Amoraim, and this is also often true about the Yerushalmi, that Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael, first generation Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael, have a much easier time contradicting the Mishnah than Amora'ei Bavel. In part, like why that is, it's up for debate, but Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael, especially the first generation, they're right after Rebbe who compiled the Mishnah. They're living in the same world, in the same area. But for them, the Mishnah, they see themselves as kind of a continuation of the tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh that landed in the Mishnah. Whereas Rav and Shmuel and Amora'ei Bavel, they've already they're living in another place. They see themselves as in a kind of separate period from the period of the Tanaim. They see the Mishnah less as a tradition of which they're also a part, and more as a text that they have some kind of multilayered to. So this is one example of a place where early Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael are more comfortable directly contradicting the deen in the Mishnah. That's what we've got so far. But then, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish think Shibuda is deorayta, property liens are deorayta. Rav and Shmuel think it's not. Then we get stage 2, which really is in the Gemara. It's presented as stage 1, which are Ula and Rabba, two third generation Amoraim. So Ula first, and then Rabba, who are going to interpret the Mishnah through the lens of this machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Ula, who is a third generation Amora Eretz Yisrael, is going to interpret the Mishnah via the principle of Shibuda deorayta, that property liens are deorayta, which is to say, he's going to take the principle of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and yet massage how that principle fits with the deen so that it fits with the deen of the Mishnah. Because the third generation, even though he's one of the Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael, at this point already, the third generation Amoraim feel some kind of sense of obligation to the Mishnah as an authoritative text. On the other hand, he has the tradition of Amora'ei Eretz Yisrael who think that Shibuda is deorayta. So Ula is going to explain the deen of the Mishnah which draws a distinction between malva bishtar and malva al peh, according to the principle that Shibuda deorayta. So Amar Ula Devar Torah Echad Malva B'Shtar V'Echad Malva Al Peh Gova Min Nechasim Mishubadim. Theoretically, mi deorayta, both a Malva B'Shtar and a Malva Al Peh should collect from liened property. My time a Shibuda deorayta, right? Why? Because Shibuda is deorayta, like Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish said. But Ela Ma Ta'am Amru Malva Al Peh Gova Eno Gova Ela Min Nechasim B'Nei Chorin. But why is it that Limaskana in the end a Malva Al Peh does not collect from nechasim mishubadim, because it's a takana d'Rabbanan mishum psida delikuchot. We don't want the buyers to lose out, right? On some level, it's not so fair to say that if I borrowed money from Reuven and then Reuven went and sold a house, so I can collect that house that was sold, right? That was sold to some random third party who never borrowed money. So why should I be able to go and show up at his doorstep and foreclose his house? So there's a takana d'Rabbanan that mishum psida de lekuchot, because we don't want the lekuchot to lose out. We don't collect from nechasim mishubadim. So that's, but ihachi malva b'shtar nami. Theoretically, that should apply to malva b'shtar and malva al peh. Shouldn't matter. The lekuchot are losing out in any case. The answer to the Gemara hatem Iyun de afsidu and afshayhu. So in a case of malva b'shtar, the lokhim, the person who bought the house, should have known that there was an outstanding loan, and you should check before you buy property whether there are any outstanding loans on the property that are mishubadim to the property that you're buying, and you can check. But and that's certainly true in the case in which the loan is documented. In the case in which the loan is not documented, then we would not necessarily have, right. Then it's not really the buyer's fault because he wouldn't know. That's Ula. So Ula says Shibuda deorayta, like Amora Eretz Yisrael, he's sort of continuing in their tradition. But on the other hand, the Halakha, he does not paskin that, he paskins like the Mishnah that malva al peh actually does not collect from nechasim mishubadim. Rava takes the opposite, the opposite angle. He is going to have to explain malva b'shtar, right, the case where you do collect from nechasim mishubadim, according to the principle of Amora Bavel, that Shibuda lav deorayta, that property liens are not deorayta. So what does Rava say? Rava says, Devar Torah echad malva b'shtar ve'echad malva al peh eino gova el min nechasim b'nei chorin. Nobody midoraita can collect from nechasim mishubadim. Nobody can go foreclose the house. My time, Shibuda lav deorayta, because shibud nechasim is not deorayta. So ma ta'am amru malva b'shtar gova min nechasim mishubadim. So why is it then that someone who loans property, someone who loans money via a shtar, via a document, can collect from liened property? Why? Kadesha lotin ol dalet bifnei lovi. It is a takana d'Rabbanan in order to incentivize lending, which is to say, if I lend money to Reuven, and Reuven has property on hand, but I can't collect liened property, then how am I supposed to know that I'm ever going to get my money back? He might blow all the money that I lent him and then have nothing to pay me back. Shibud nechasim ensures that I, as the lender, feel secure that I'll get my money back, and therefore it will incentivize it, right? In a society, the principle of shibud nechasim incentivizes more lending because it gives the lenders a sense of security that they will get their money back, right? Kadesha lotino dalet bifnei lovin, so that the door is not closed before borrowers, which is to say, so that people lend money. Right? If that's the case, though, then we want to incentivize all kinds of lending, including right? And why should we want to incentivize all kinds of lending, including lending even without a shtar? Why should it be that Shalotino Delet only applies to Malva Bishtar? The Gemara answers Hatam Letle Kala, which is to say that there's really no way in a case of Malva Al Peh, there's no way for the buyer to be aware at all of the fact that there's an outstanding loan. So when it comes down to it, we're trying to weigh motivation benefits for the different sides. On the one hand, we want to incentivize lending. On the other hand, we don't want everyone who buys property all the time to be constantly afraid that it might be liened, and if they have no way of knowing, they have no way of knowing. So we only make this takana shelo delet in a case in which it's not that bad for the buyer, because the buyer could try to suss things out in advance and know whether or not there's an outstanding lien on the property. That part's less important, but fundamentally what Rabba is saying, deorayta, there's no shibud nechasim, and there's a specific takana of shibud nechasim in the area where we can make that takana, which is to say, malva bishtar. Why? Kadei shelo tinodel bifnei lovim, so that we can incentivize people to lend. So, right, on the one hand, we have Ula saying there is a deorayta lien, but when it comes to loans made al peh, in order to prevent an unjust result for people who buy property, we don't say that property is liened. On the other hand, we have Rabbah following the tradition of Amora'e Bavel saying there is no lien deorayta, but for loans made in writing, Chazal instituted a lien because otherwise no one would agree to lend money. So just to kind of paint the picture, even in kind of chronological order, what we have in our Mishnah is this distinction between malva al peh and malva b'shtar. There's a lien. A property is liened to loans made in writing, b'shtar, but not loans made verbally al peh. Then next generation, we get Rav and Shmuel on the one side and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish on the other side. Rav and Shmuel saying property liens, who think that property liens are not deorayta, and therefore verbal loans have no lien. Theoretically, the Babylonian Amorim fit well with, or they accept the deen of our Mishnah. Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan on the other end, who think that property liens are deorayta, and therefore they disagree with our Mishnah. People who borrow money verbally, borrow money al peh, theoretically they would be goveh min halekuchot, meaning the property would be liened in that case. So the Amoraim of Eretz Yisrael disagree even the Ma'aseh with the deen of our Mishnah. They think that malva al peh can collect from nechasim mishubadim. Then we get Rabbah on the one hand and Ula on the other hand. Rabbah following the tradition of Eretz Yisrael of Amora'e Bavel, saying property liens are not deorayta, but and then explaining the deen in our Mishnah of malva bishtar, the lien on written loans is a takana to incentivize lending. Ula, on the other hand, property liens are deorayta. He makes that fit. He makes the principle of Amora'e Eretz Yisrael fit into our Mishnah, which is to say that despite the fact that liens are deorayta, that shibud nechasim is deorayta, there are no liens on loans made al peh because as a takana for the sake of the buyers. Okay, Adkan the Gemara, and then Rav Papa comes a later Amora generations later and paskins. Right, he's responding to this machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about whether whether a malva al peh can collect from heirs on the one hand and from buyers on the other hand. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say yes, you can collect from both. Nechasim mishubadim. Rav and Shmuel say no, you can't collect from either. And Rav Papa comes to a compromise position. We're going to see that a parallel sugya with the machloket Rav Shmuel on the one and Rabbi Yochanan on the other, and then Rav Papa paskini shows up here and in Kiddushin. But the Rav Papa's psak is a little bit different here from where it is in Kiddushin, and then this is going to be the opening for the machloket for a big machloket rishonim about how to read Rav Papa here in relation to Rav Papa in Kiddushin, and a more broad machloket about really how to think about the text of the Gemara more broadly. So in our sugya here in Bava Batra, Rav Papa paskins that hilchata malva al peh gova min yorshim ve'eno gova min halakha. So Rav Papa paskins a compromise position between Rav Shmuel on the one hand and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish on the other, which is to say that there is shibud nechasim when it comes to the heirs, right? I lend money to Ruvain. Ruvain dies and his house goes to his heirs. So the money lender, can go to his heirs and collect. But if he sold the house, I can't go and collect the house from the buyers. Why? In our sugya, what does Rav Papa say? He says, "Gova min yorshim kadei shelo tinodel bifnei lovin." Right? He can collect from the heirs as a way to incentivize me and future people to lend money. If you can't collect from heirs, then no one's going to lend money. But you don't collect from the buyers because we're talking about a case where I was malva al peh, there was no shtar. The buyer had no way of knowing, so it's really not his fault if he bought a house. It's not fair for me to be able to come and collect from. So Rav Papa here paskins a compromise between Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about the case of malva al peh, about the heirs versus the buyers in case of malva al peh. And if we notice, he uses the language that Rabbah used. He uses the language of the Gemara of Rabbah's explanation of the distinction between malva bishtar and malva al peh, right? The explanation of Kadesh Lotuno Dala Bifnei Lovin was why Rabbah said that a malva that there's that property is liened on written loans, and Eno Govim Kuchot is the same, right? This is ultimately the same thing as Rabbah was saying about a malva al peh. Why can't I collect from the lekuchot, from the buyers? In Kiddushin, though, we see Rav Papa brings the same deen, but explains it differently. Rav Papa says, again, the compromise position between Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. You can take from the heirs, but you can't take from the buyers. Why? Why here he says because Shibuda deorayta. Because Shibud is deorayta, that's why you can collect from the heirs. Theoretically, Shibud nechasim is deorayta. But Eino govem min halukuchot delet lekala. Right? Eino govem min halukuchot, same thing, right? Because there's no way for the buyers to know. Theoretically, it must mean some kind of there's a takanaf of midirabanan not to collect because of the lekuchot, who they had no way of knowing that there would have been a lien on this property. Now, if you look at the sugya in Bava Batra, right? I said Rav Papa borrowed Rabbah's language, right? Rabbah's language, though, was a language according to the idea that Shibud was not deorayta, right? Rabbah thinks, like Rav and Shmuel, that Shibuda lav deorayta. Therefore, you could collect on a loan on a shtar, collect lien property on a shtar. Why? As a takana, right? So from the language in Bava Batra, it makes it sound like Rav Papa thinks that Shibuda lav deorayta. He thinks like Rabbah. And the distinction that Rabbah makes between shtar and alpeh, he makes within alpeh between yorshim and lekuchot, between heirs and inheritors. Whereas in Kiddushin, it seems like Rabbah thinks that Shibuda is deorayta. And the fact that he doesn't collect in the case of the lekuchot that's the takana, right? It seems like he thinks they're more like Ula, or more like Ula, like Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, that Me'ikar Hadin Shibuda, it seems deorayta. Now, this is where the Rishonim are going to come in, and they're going to have to be machriya. They're going to have to decide between these sugya and also try to explain, right, what's going on, right? What does Rav Papa actually think? How do we paskin? And what is the relationship between the sugya? We're going to see 4 different positions of the Rishonim. We're going to see the Rif. We're going to see two different positions brought in Tosafot, and we're going to see another answer brought in the Ramban. So, right, just to review, Rav Papa here, it seems like he thinks that Shibud, in Bava Batra, thinks that Shibud is not deorayta. That theoretically there is a special takana for the Yorshim, the same way that there's a special takana for the shtar. Whereas in Kiddushin, it seems like Rav Papa paskins that Shibud nechasim, that liens are deorayta. But when it comes to malva al peh, we have this distinction. We want to be lenient on the lekuchot. We want mishub say to the lekuchot, and that only applies in case of lekuchot. It doesn't apply with yorshim. Now, what is the Rif? Right, the Rif looks at this stira in apparent stira in Divrei Rav Papa, and he says, right, the hadika pasuk Rav Papa hacha ve'amar hilchata malva peh govim yorshim ve'eno govim lekuchot govim yorshim shalotino del bifnei living. Right, here the fact where it seems like in our sugya Bava Batra he thinks that that it looks like he's posketing that Shibuda lav deorayta, that property liens are not deorayta. But there he says that in Kiddushin he says that they are. So what does the Rif say? Lav de plige dideh. It's not that he's contradicting himself. Ella ha kamashmalan, right? Rather, in our sugya, when he says shalotino delet, it's not that he's saying lav midorayta. Ella kamashmalan dehayin taima de ukma rabbanan adeorayta. The lotino delet bifnei lovin in Bava Batra, when Rav Papa says that we want to incentivize lending, is not a reason why Chachamim made a takana on something that is deorayta doesn't exist. Rather, it's the reason why he's explaining the reason why Chachamim didn't make a takana. We want to incentivize lending, and that's a reason not to make the takana of pseida de lekuchot. So Kiddushin Rav Papa is explicit, right? We saw before that in Kiddushin he says Shibuda deorayta. He says it explicitly. So the Rif goes, he says that's the central sugya because he says it explicitly there. That's really what he means. He thinks Shibuda deorayta. And here it looks like he's saying Shibuda lav deorayta, but that's not really what he's saying. He's not saying shalotino delet, incentivizing lending is a reason to make a takana. I'm saying it's a reason not to make the takana. It's a reason to leave it with the deorayta rule in the case of the yorshim. That's the Rif. Tosafot in Bava Batra goes a totally different direction. right? What does he say? Yesh lefaresh, says Tosafot, de Rav Papa lo amar ella malva al peh gova min yorshim ve'ino gova min lukuchot. What part of the statement that we saw before here was actually divrei Rav Papa? Right? The way we read it before was that the whole thing, the whole passage was divrei Rav Papa, and it seems like there's a contradiction within it. Tosafot saying no. What Rav Papa actually said is just that first line. Which is to say that verbal loans are all he poskined was the compromise position between Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. He said there's a distinction between heirs and buyers. And what's the after that? The explanation, Shibuda deorayta, lo tinol delet, blah 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 blah. All of that is not Rav Papa himself. The Gemara mefarish la. That's the Gemara's interpretation of Rav Papa's psak. So Gemara mefarish la hacha lemanda amar Shibuda lav deorayta. So here in our sugya in Bava Batra, the Gemara is explaining Rav Papa according to the Shita that Shibuda lav deorayta, according to the world of Amora Bavel who think that property liens are not deorayta. The Hadam, and there in Kiddushin lemanda amar Shibuda deorayta. There he's explaining it according to the position that Shibuda deorayta. Right, so it's almost like an ikeda amre. It's almost as though there are like two traditions in the world of Rav Papa, two traditions about what Rav Papa actually thought. He said we've made a compromise between Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, and we interpret it in one of two ways: one way in Bava Batra and one way in Perushim. And we see that in other places. So Rav Papa himself only said the first sentence, which is the same in the two Masechtot, and there are two traditions about what comes next, which disagree about whether or not Shi'abud is deorayta. That's opinion number one in Tosafot and Bava Batra. Tosafot in Kiddushin brings another possibility in the name of Rabbeinu Hanan, which is going to be that actually there isn't a contradiction between divrei Rav Papa, but that Rav Papa in the two sugyas is talking about two different things. It's true in both sugyas we bring the machloket Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish and Rav and Shmuel about malva al peh. But according to Tosafot, in the sugya in Kiddushin, part of this, in order to understand it, we would have to see the full context of Kiddushin, which we don't have time to do right now. But the context of that machloket as it's brought in Kiddushin is actually not about a regular loan. It's not about I lent money to Reuven and then he went and sold his house. But it's about a case in which Reuven's chiyuv was a chiyuv min haTorah, right? The classic example brought in that Gemara is a korban of a yoledet. So a woman who gives birth and has to bring a korban, and then she dies, right? Is the money that was sort of owed as a korban, does that go on to her yorshim? Do her yorshim have to bring a korban in her name? So it looks like Rav Papa is poskening about this machloket Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, but really Rav Papa is poskening about that above machloket in Kiddushin. That's what Rabbeinu Hanan is supposed to say. So dahacha ma'ari b'milva k'tuva b'Torah kagon nezikin ve'erchin ve'korban. Right here in Kiddushin, we're talking about those kinds of obligations, right? Not a regular loan, but these kinds of deorayta monetary obligations. Da amar la'el the Shibuda deorayta, and that's where Rav Papa thinks that Shibud is deorayta, that the lien is deorayta, and that it therefore passes on to the yorshim, and then not to the lukuchot as a takana. Right? Delo shayach taima de ni'ila delet de linyan yorshim asaum kimava bishtar. Right? That there, right, the idea of Ne'ilah Delet and right, the idea of incentivizing lending, we're not talking about lending. We're just talking about the money that's like owed to God, really, or owed for other reasons. Let's say I owe someone money because I, crashed into their car, right? That money that's owed, it's not a loan, but I owe that money. So there, Shi'abud would be deorayta. But in our sugya in Bava Batra, where that when it comes that in those cases, I crash someone else's car and owe them money, or I owe this korban, right? Obligations that are incumbent upon me, not because I made a loan, but because of some kind of Torah principle, either that I have to pay damages or that I have to owe this korban. There, Shi'abud is deorayta. You can collect from the yorshim, but we do this takana for lukuchot, that we don't make the lukuchot come and pay because that wouldn't be fair to them. Aval hatam, but there, aka in our sugya in Bava Batra, the maval peh with she'ein k'tuva b'Torah, we're talking about a real regular loan, not something that is a chidush of the Torah or anything like that, but a regular loan. So there, right there, when Rav Papa says lo tinol delet and all that, he's saying that Shibuda lav deorayta with a regular halva'ah, Shibud is not deorayta. So with Papa here, the way that Tosafot or Rabbeinu Hananel in this case is explains the difference between these two sugyot is actually saying there's no stira. Rav Papa is saying two different things in these two different sugyot because he's actually talking about two different cases. In Kiddushin, he's talking about cases which are defined as milvah k'tuva b'Torah, right? Torah loans or Torah obligations, like nizikin, like I crashed your car, or like this korban of the yoledet, right? And in those cases, shibuda is deorayta. In those cases, the property is liened. The property is liened even midoraita. Whereas in Bava Batra, in our sugya, we're talking about regular loans, and there in those cases, the lien on the property is not deorayta. And that explains the difference between Rav Papa's language in one sugya and Rav Papa's language in the other. The final answer that we'll look at is an answer brought in the Ramban, which is Rav Papa Lunit Kavein Elif So Halakha Shegov Min Yerushim Ve'enu Gov Min Kochot. Sort of, it's going to look sort of similar to the first answer we saw in Tosafot, which he starts out the same way to say that Rav Papa, what he really meant to do, what he really cared about doing was being paskening halakha. He paskins this compromise position between Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, and says that that there's shibud nechasim when it comes to the heirs, but not shibud nechasim when it comes to the lekuchot, to the buyers. But rather than saying we have two different traditions in terms of what Rav Papa meant, we're going to say that Rav Papa was doing different things in the different sugyot. So the Amar Hacha, and here in Kiddushin, right? Afilu lemanda Amar Gova Mini Yorshim Mishum Shibuda deorayta. Afal pikein eno Gova Mini lekuchot Takinu Rabbanana deorayta. So even if you think right in Kiddushin, he's saying yes Yorshim, no lekuchot. Even if you think the reason why I collect from the Yorshim, from the heirs, is because Shibuda is deorayta, even if I think Shibuda is deorayta, I still don't collect from the lekuchot because there's this takana for the sake of the lekuchot. The hatam, and here and there, meaning for us here in our sugya and Bava Batra, hatam nami amar afilu tema Shibuda lav deorayta, right? Even if you think that Shibuda is not deorayta, even if you think like Rabbah and Rav and Shmuel that Shibuda is not deorayta, and that's why you do what the Mishnah says, which is you don't collect, right? Don't collect from the lekuchot. There's no property lien when it comes to collecting from the buyers. Reuben sold his house. I can't go and show up and foreclose it. Even though Shibuda, right, lav deorayta, you would still go from the Yorshim, mishum takana, right? You would still collect from the Yorshim, because of this takana. The same way that we made the takana for the shtar, that Shalotin Odelet, so we would make the same takana for the Yorshim. Right? Rav Papa meant to rule about the practical halacha, which would be the same no matter what you think about the principle. No matter whether you think Shibuda deorayta or Shibuda lav deorayta, I still can say there's a distinction between Gova Mina Yorshim and Gova Mina lekuchot. So in Kiddushin, even someone who thinks that liens are deorayta would agree that you don't collect from the lekuchot, from the buyers. And in Bava Batra, even someone who thinks that liens are not deorayta would agree that you can collect from the heirs as this takana to incentivize lending. So let's just make some seder out of these shitot. We're going to talk about with each shita, how do they address the contradiction? What do they think Rav Papa meant? And kind of going one step deeper, what are the kind of methodological underpinnings or the assumptions that are underpinning their explanation of the Gemara? So let's start with the Rif, right? What does Rav Papa really think? He thinks he says explicitly in Kiddushin that liens are deorayta. Bava Batra, we have to weirdly stretch the Gemara to say Lotin Odelet, that's not actually a takana. The incentivizing lending thing isn't a takana, it's a reason not to make a takana. Tough in the text, but that's what the Rif does. He prioritizes when Rav Papa explicitly says about the principle, which is, he says in Kiddushin. And Tosafot in Bava Batra, what Rav Papa says is really just the part that's the same across the two sugyot, and the contradiction is just in the question of the interpretation of his opinion, which is different in the different sugyot. Tosafot in Kiddushin says actually each sugya is dealing with a different kind of loan, right? One is, let's say, the korban of the yoledet, the money that's sort of owed as a deorayta principle, and the other is talking about a regular loan, and therefore Rav Papa is saying different things in different contexts. And the shita of the Acherim Shamru in the Ramban, which is that in each sugya, Rav Papa tried to explain the same deen according to different principles, according to Shibuda deorayta in one, and according to Shibuda lav deorayta in the other. What does Rav Papa actually think? So for the Rif, Rav Papa thinks Shibuda deorayta, liens are deorayta, Tosafot and Bava Batra thinks that actually, no, we have two different traditions about where Papa thought. Maybe he thought this, maybe he thought that. It's like an Ika de Amri in Divrei Papa. Tosafot in Kiddushin thinks no, Rav Papa has one consistent opinion that just is that things are different in different cases. With a Torah loan, with Milva K'tuva Torah, with the korban of the Yoledet, with the guy who crashed the car, then there is a liyun deorayta. But with a regular milva al peh, with a regular verbal loan, they're not. And the Shitota Achirim in the Rabban is that Rav Papa was really ruling about Halakha Lemasa, and he said, I think the same thing no matter what you think about Shibuda deorayta. I'm not going to tell you necessarily what I think. I'm going to say, afilu lemanda amar Shibuda deorayta or not. And now really what's the kind of methodological assumption underpinning the position, or the positions of each of these Rishonim? What do they really think about the Gemara? How do we resolve or understand contradictions in the Gemara? So the Rif, we don't want to see the Rif is actually he's kind of positing this in a sort of almost a way that we tend to think of Tosfot doing in general, which is trying to not see contradictions in the Gemara and sometimes massaging the pshat of one Gemara in order to make it fit with the other. So right, there's no contradiction between the Gemara. One names the principle, the other is it looks like it's saying a different principle, but actually it's just providing an explanation for the first principle. Tosfot and Bava Batra. Ika de Amre b'divrei Papa. Sure, there can be different traditions about what Papa thought. The sugyas don't necessarily have to fully fit together, which is a little atypical for Tosfot, but even here, look, even Tosfot can sometimes say that sometimes sugyot can contradict each other. Tosfot in Kiddushin is a much more classic Tosfot style ukimta sort of way of understanding this contradiction. Actually, even though it looks like they're talking about the same case, it looks like Rav Papa is paskening on Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, who have the same machloka. Actually, Rav Papa is saying something, talking about a different context here and there, and therefore the rules can be different. And the Achirim in the Ramban, right, thinks that Shibuda, Shibuda deorayta or lav deorayta, that's not Rav Papa's main concern. His main concern is what's the deen. Rav Papa is a halachic thinker who's trying to pass in the halakha, and therefore he gives us a consistent halachic position and wants to explain that even right l'chol hashitot, right, according to any different way of conceptually understanding the nature of the deen and the nature of property liens, whether it's deorayta or not. I still think what I think. That's Rav Papa, according to the Achirim and the Ramban. So it was a bit of a heavy load today, but I think in keeping with the fact that we're closing Bava Batra, which was in many ways a heavy masechet. Wishing everyone a huge mazal tov on the siyum of Bava Batra and on the siyum of all of Masechet Nezikin. And thanks so much, and see you next week.